I started the hike early in the morning, long before the sun came over the hills. The air was damp and cool, with the smell of wet soil and pine needles heavy around me. The sky was still gray, and everything was quiet except for the sound of my boots pressing into the dirt trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, and even though I wasn't going with anyone, I convinced myself I would be fine alone. I had checked the map many times, packed enough water, food, a flashlight, an emergency blanket, and a small first aid kit. The trail wasn't supposed to be difficult, just long, and I thought the solitude would do me good. The first few miles went by slowly. The ground was uneven, with roots sticking out and rocks scattered across the path. My legs felt stiff at first, but after a while I warmed up and fell into a steady rhythm. The sound of birds started to rise as the light grew stronger. I could hear water somewhere far off to my right, maybe a creek running downhill. The air felt clean in my chest, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this time alone, away from everything noisy and crowded in life. The trail kept climbing. It wasn't steep, but it was constant. I noticed my breathing growing louder, and the strap of my backpack dug into my shoulders. I stopped once to take a sip of water, leaning against a fallen log. The forest stretched out around me, tall trees that made the sky seem far away. The sun was still hidden, and the whole place felt like it was stuck between night and day. After about 3 hours, I reached a section where the trail narrowed. The ground dropped steeply to one side, and I could see the tops of trees far below. On the other side, the hillside rose almost vertical, with loose stones and tangled roots. The dirt was packed tight, but parts of it looked worn, as if rain had eaten small trenches into the path. I moved carefully, keeping my weight balanced. One slip would have sent me sliding down into the trees below. I kept walking. The trail wound back into thicker forest, where the light barely touched the ground. My boots sank slightly into damp soil, and the smell of rot and moss was everywhere. I thought about how far I had already come, and how long it would take me to get back if I turned around. The map I studied showed that the trail made a loop, and I was determined to finish it. Hours passed. I ate a granola bar as I walked, chewing slowly, keeping my eyes on the ground. The trail signs were small wooden posts with faded arrows, and I had to stop at each one to make sure I was going the right way. At one point, I came across a fork where the sign had fallen. It lay in the dirt, half buried. I brushed off the dirt and saw the arrow pointing left, so I followed that direction. The forest started to change as the day stretched on. The trees grew further apart, and the ground became rocky. Sunlight hit the path in bright patches, making the dirt look pale and dry. My shadow stretched long ahead of me, and I realized how slow I was moving. I checked my watch and saw it was already late afternoon. I still had many miles before the loop would bring me back near the trailhead. I pushed forward, but I started to feel uneasy. The trail was harder to follow now. Grass and weeds grew up in places, and sections of the dirt looked unused. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I had gone the wrong way at the fork. I looked back more than once, but the trees all looked the same, and there was no clear mark of where I had come from. The air grew hotter. Sweat soaked my shirt, and dust clung to my arms. I drank more water, realizing with a slow dread that I was drinking faster than I had planned. My bottle was already half empty, and I still had hours to go. I tried to ration myself, forcing my throat to stay dry longer. As evening came, the forest grew silent again. The birds had quieted, and even the insects seemed to fade into the background. My steps sounded louder on the dirt. The trail dipped down into a hollow, where the ground was soft and muddy. My boots sank with every step, and the smell of stagnant water filled the air. I saw broken branches in the mud, maybe where deer had passed. When I climbed out of the hollow, I realized the sun was almost gone. The sky between the trees burned orange and pink, but under the canopy it was already dark. My chest tightened with panic. I had thought I would be back before night, but I had clearly miscalculated. I stopped and tried to steady my breathing. I had a flashlight, but the batteries were not new. If they failed, I would be stuck in total darkness. I picked up my pace, forcing my legs to keep moving even as my thighs burned. The trail grew rough again, twisting through stones and thick brush. Branches scraped against my arms. I stumbled once and caught myself with my hands, leaving dirt on my palms. My backpack felt heavier by the minute, as if every item inside doubled its weight. Darkness came fast. I finally pulled out my flashlight, clicking it on. The weak beam cut a narrow path ahead of me, barely reaching 10 feet. Everything outside the beam was swallowed by blackness. The forest no longer looked the same. Every tree seemed twisted, every shadow thick and alive. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to stay calm. The trail was harder to follow in the dark. The dirt blended with fallen leaves, and I had to stop often to check for signs of where the path went. Once, I realized I had been walking in the wrong direction for nearly 10 minutes. I cursed myself, spun around, and tried to retrace my steps. The panic clawed at my throat again. Hours passed in the dark. My legs trembled from exhaustion, and I had to sit down more than once. Each time I rested, I turned off the flashlight to save the battery. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The sounds of the forest grew louder in those moments. Cracking branches, faint rustles, something moving far off but close enough to remind me I was not alone out there. At one point, I heard heavy steps not far from the trail. I froze, my breath shallow, straining to hear. It moved through the brush slowly, deliberate, like it was following. I stayed still for long minutes, praying it would fade. Eventually, the sound moved away, but the fear lingered deep in my stomach. I knew animals lived in these woods, bears, mountain lions, but hearing one that close in the dark was enough to make my skin crawl. I forced myself up again. My legs shook, but I had no choice. If I stopped for too long, I would fall asleep, and I knew sleeping out there would be dangerous. I had no tent, no real protection. Around midnight, I reached a clearing. The moonlight made the grass silver, and for the first time in hours, I could see more than a few feet around me. I dropped my backpack and drank the last of my water. My throat was dry as sandpaper, and my stomach cramped from hunger. I ate the last granola bar slowly, trying to make it last. I felt small in that open space exposed under the wide sky. I pulled out the map again, shining the flashlight over it. My hands shook as I traced the lines. If I was reading it right, I had somehow wandered onto a side trail that stretched far longer than the main loop. I was miles off from where I needed to be, and the only way back was to keep walking through the night. My legs barely carried me, but I had no choice. The hours blurred together. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving just outside the light. My chest tightened each time, until I realized they were only trees or bushes. My mind was playing tricks on me. By dawn, my flashlight flickered weakly. The battery was almost gone. I turned it off and let the gray morning light guide me. My eyes burned, and every step felt like fire in my legs. My lips were cracked, my tongue heavy from thirst. Finally, as the sun rose higher, I heard something that made me cry from relief. The sound of water. I stumbled toward it, crashing through brush until I reached a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I dropped to my knees and drank deeply, ignoring the ache in my stomach. I filled my empty bottle and drank again, until the edge of panic finally eased. I followed the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me closer to civilization. After another hour, I saw a dirt road cutting across the forest. My heart leapt. I stumbled onto it, my legs nearly giving out. The road led me to a parking lot, half full of cars. And there, at the edge, was my own vehicle, dusty but waiting. I collapsed against it, letting out a long breath I didn't know I was holding. I had survived the night, but barely. My body was scraped, bruised, and exhausted. My backpack hung loose, almost empty, but I was alive. The mistake had been mine from the start, misjudging time, ignoring how quickly the forest could swallow me. I learned that day that nature does not care about plans, confidence, or comfort. It only gives what it gives, and it takes just as easily. I never hiked alone again after that. I had been planning this hike for weeks. I wanted something remote, something far from busy trails where people clogged the paths with loud voices and plastic bottles. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind that makes you feel small against the landscape. I studied maps, read trip reports, and picked a trail deep in the mountains where the forest grew thick and the ridges cut the horizon into sharp lines. The plan was simple: start early, hike up into the higher basin, spend a night in my small tent, and then loop back the following day. It looked straightforward on the map, but I knew from past experience that maps often lied. Distances stretched longer than they looked. Elevation gains burned more in your legs than the numbers suggested. But I still packed with confidence: light sleeping bag, tent, a few meals, a filter for water, and a small first aid kit. I made sure to throw in my compass and the map I had folded over and marked with notes. I thought I was ready. That morning, the air felt cold against my face. I started down the narrow dirt road that led to the trailhead, gravel crunching under my boots. The trees closed in almost immediately, tall pines that blocked most of the light. The sound of the world outside disappeared behind me, and only the faint wind in the branches stayed with me. The forest smelled damp, almost metallic, from last night's rain. The first miles were easy, a gentle climb along an old logging path that had grown over. I felt strong, moving quickly with the weight of my pack still light on my shoulders. The path was narrow, with thick brush clawing at the sides, but the tread was still visible. A stream ran beside it for a while, and I refilled my water. The cold water stung my teeth when I took a drink, and it woke me up even more. After about 4 hours, the trail began to thin out. What was once a clear path turned into something faint. The dirt tread faded, replaced by patches of grass and roots. I pulled out the map, checked my compass, and reassured myself that I was still on course. The line on the map showed that the trail would bend north and climb toward a saddle between two ridges. I adjusted my direction and kept climbing. It didn't take long before the path completely vanished. I stopped and looked around. Behind me, the faint line of trampled dirt was swallowed by brush. Ahead of me, nothing but tangled branches and rock. I pulled out the map again. My finger traced the faint dotted line on the paper, but standing there, nothing matched. The ground sloped up, but it looked steeper than I expected. I thought maybe the trail had been washed out or grown over. Trails disappear sometimes, especially in areas people rarely visit. I decided to push forward, thinking I'd eventually reconnect with it. The climb became harder. The slope forced me to dig my boots into loose soil and grab at tree trunks to pull myself up. Sweat poured down my back despite the cool air. My pack felt heavier with each step. I kept glancing down at the compass, trying to stay oriented north, trying to believe I was still moving toward the saddle. Hours passed. My legs burned. I kept expecting to see some kind of marker. An old blaze on a tree, a cairn of stacked rocks, but there was nothing. Only thick woods pressing in on every side. The silence was heavy. No voices, no distant road noise. Just the sound of my breathing, the scrape of my boots, and the occasional snap of a twig. Once, I heard something larger moving through the brush to my right, but when I froze and looked, the sound stopped. My heart thudded in my chest. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe an elk. Still, I kept glancing that way, my nerves stretched thin. Eventually, I admitted to myself that I wasn't on the trail anymore. I was just walking uphill into nowhere. I decided to stop, set down my pack, and think. I sat on a fallen log, drank water, and studied the map. I tried to match the folds of the land around me to the lines on the paper, but it all blurred together. Everything looked the same: slopes, ridges, valleys hidden by trees. I realized how little visibility I had. Above the treetops, there might have been landmarks, but all I saw was the dark green wall around me. The sun had shifted. Shadows stretched long. I hadn't expected to still be searching for the trail this late. A wave of unease rolled through me. I forced myself to stay calm. Panic was worse than anything out here. I made a choice. I would set up camp before dark. Moving without a clear path at night was dangerous. I found a small flat area beneath some fir trees, cleared away sticks, and set up my tent. The The small fabric walls looked fragile in the growing dark, but they were something. I boiled water for food, ate quickly, and crawled inside. The night dragged. Every small sound outside my tent made me freeze. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and now and then I heard distant cracks echoing like something moving through the woods. I told myself it was animals. That didn't stop the knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Sleep came in short bursts. I'd drift off, only to wake at the sound of something brushing against the fabric of my tent or the distant call of something I couldn't identify. When the sky finally began to lighten, I packed up fast. I decided to change tactics. Instead of pushing forward blindly, I would backtrack and try to find the last clear sign of trail I had seen. I started downhill, following what I thought was the same route I had taken up. But soon, the slope twisted differently, and I realized I was not retracing the same line. The forest warped my sense of direction. Every ridge looked the same. The compass needle kept steady, but the terrain tricked my mind. I began to understand how people could wander in circles out here. I tried to fight that thought off, but it clung to me. By midday, I was exhausted and no closer to finding the trail. My legs ached. My throat felt dry even though I drank steadily. The food in my pack looked smaller each time I checked. The reality that I was lost settled deeper. That afternoon, I found something that chilled me more than anything else. As I pushed through a thicket of brush, I stepped into a small clearing and saw an old campsite. There was a blackened fire ring, stones arranged in a circle. A log had been dragged close like a seat, but it looked abandoned. Moss grew over the stones. The wood was soft with rot. I crouched and touched the ashes in the fire pit. They crumbled into powder between my fingers, long cold. Someone had camped here maybe years ago. They had been lost too, or maybe just exploring. For a moment, it felt like I was walking in someone else's footsteps, repeating the same mistakes. I pressed on. The next night, I camped near a small stream. The ground was damp, but I needed the water. I set my tent farther back in the trees and kept my food sealed in a bag tied to a branch. The night sounds were louder here. Something splashed in the stream. Something else moved slowly through the brush nearby. I lay awake, my body rigid, waiting for footsteps that never came. By the third day, my fear had turned sharp. My food was running low. I rationed it to small handfuls, but hunger gnawed at me. My legs felt weak. Blisters burned on my feet. I tried climbing higher to get a view, hoping to spot a landmark, but the ridges only showed me more endless forest. No roads, no roofs, nothing. I felt small in a way I'd never felt before. The world stretched out without edges, and I was a speck swallowed inside it. That afternoon, storm clouds rolled in. The sky darkened fast, and wind howled through the trees. Rain hammered down, soaking me before I could even pull on my jacket. The ground turned slick. Every step was a fight not to slide. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled my chest. Lightning lit up the trees in white flashes. I scrambled downhill, desperate for shelter, and found a shallow overhang of rock. I wedged myself beneath it, shivering as the storm raged. Water poured down in sheets, splashing against the rocks. I hugged my knees, waiting, counting seconds between thunder. The storm lasted for hours. When it finally eased, the world outside was dripping, the forest steaming with mist. I stepped out, but the land had changed. The soil had slid in places. Small streams had carved new channels down the slope. Any faint sense of direction I had was gone. By now, I knew I wasn't just off the trail. I was completely lost. The fourth day bled into the fifth. Time blurred. I walked until my legs screamed, then stopped and collapsed onto the ground. My mind grew cloudy from hunger. I thought often about the map folded in my pack, but it no longer felt like it belonged to this place. The paper lines meant nothing against the endless, repeating forest. I started hearing things. Not voices, not words, but patterns in the sounds of the woods. A branch snapping too cleanly, footsteps that seemed to match my own. Each time I froze, the forest froze with me. My heart pounded so loud it felt like it echoed through the trees. On the sixth day, I decided I couldn't. I had been planning the hike for weeks, maybe even months. The thought of getting away from everything, from the noise of work and the endless buzzing of my phone, kept me going through long days. I wanted silence. I wanted the sound of trees moving in the wind, the crunch of dirt under my boots, the sight of long valleys stretching below me. I wanted to feel like I had gone somewhere that was mine, a place that most people wouldn't bother reaching. That's why I had chosen this particular trail. It wasn't one of the popular ones. It wasn't crowded with families or groups of friends taking selfies. It was long, tough, and not marked very well, but I liked the idea of being out there alone. The trail started at a small parking area at the edge of a national forest. By the time I got there, the morning was still young. The air was cool, a little damp, the way it feels after a night of light rain. The dirt was soft, my boots sinking into it just a bit with every step. I adjusted the straps of my pack, made sure I had my water bottles in easy reach, and looked up at the sky. A thin layer of clouds stretched across it, pale and streaky, but I could tell the sun would burn through soon. I wanted to get as far as I could before it got hot. The first section of the trail was pleasant. It wound through tall trees, the kind that made the forest seem endless. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. Birds flitted between branches, some so high up I could only hear them. The ground rose slowly, not steep yet, just enough that I felt my legs working. I kept a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. I didn't want to burn out early. I stopped once to drink some water, then pushed on. After about an hour, I reached the first clearing. The trees thinned and opened to a view of rolling hills, layers of them fading into the distance. I could see the trail ahead, a faint line cutting across the slope. I stood there for a while, just breathing it in, the quiet, the sense of space. Then I kept moving. The trail got narrower as I climbed higher. Roots twisted across the dirt, and I had to watch my step to keep from tripping. The slope grew steeper, and I felt the weight of my pack pulling on my shoulders. Sweat formed on the back of my neck. I stopped to take off my jacket, tying it around my waist. When I looked back, I could see the parking lot far below, a tiny gray patch almost swallowed by trees. It was only then, looking down, that I realized how alone I was. I hadn't seen a single other person since I started. The cars I had passed earlier must have belonged to people on other trails, or maybe campers staying in the woods. For a moment, I liked it. The whole place felt like mine. But as I climbed, that thought started to shift. The forest grew thicker again, closing in around me. The path narrowed to the point where I brushed against branches and ferns. My footsteps sounded louder, sharper, as though the woods were listening. I tried to shake the thought off. It was just me out here, just the trail and the trees. Hours passed. The sun had burned through the clouds, and the air grew warmer. I drank steadily, eating a granola bar as I walked. The taste of it was dry and sweet in my mouth. I checked my watch and saw it was early afternoon. I wanted to reach the ridge by evening. That was my goal. I had read about it online. A stretch of high ground with views on both sides. People said it was hard to get to, but worth it. The higher I climbed, the rougher the trail became. Rocks jutted out of the dirt, and I had to use my hands sometimes to steady myself. The trees thinned, replaced by low shrubs and patches of grass. The air grew cooler again, but the sun was strong, and I felt it burning the skin on my arms. I stopped once to put on sunscreen, then kept pushing. That was when I noticed the first sign of something wrong. It was a sound. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the branches, but it wasn't steady enough. It came in short bursts, irregular, like something moving through the brush. I froze, listening. My heart beat harder in my chest. I turned slowly, scanning the slope below me. The trees shifted, shadows playing across the ground. For a while I saw nothing, and I told myself it was just a deer, maybe, or some small animal. But as I started walking again, I heard it once more. A crack of a branch, the scrape of something against bark. I didn't like the way it followed me. I sped up, moving quickly along the narrow trail. My pack thumped against my back. My boots slipped a little on loose dirt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but every time I looked, the trees were still. The sound stopped eventually, but the unease stayed with me. My steps felt heavier, the silence sharper. By late afternoon, I reached a flat stretch where the trees opened to one side. The slope dropped away steeply. A valley spread out below, green and endless. I stopped there, resting against a boulder, my legs aching. I dug out some food from my pack, chewing slowly as I stared down. The sun was lower now, the light turning golden. I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to make it to the ridge before dark. I pushed on, climbing again. The trail twisted and rose, sometimes disappearing under brush. I had to look carefully for the faint signs of dirt pressed down by other hikers' boots. It would be easy to lose it if I wasn't careful. And then I saw it. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. On the ground, in the dirt, there were marks. Not animal tracks, not the round prints of deer or the paw marks of something smaller. These were boot prints. Human. They were fresh, too. The edges still sharp, the dirt around them not yet dried or blown away. Someone else had been here. But the strange thing was, they didn't go in one direction. They circled, doubled back, stopped, as though whoever made them had wandered aimlessly. I crouched down, studying them. Some prints overlapped, pressing deep into the soil. I felt a chill run through me, even in the late afternoon sun. I kept walking, but slower now, my senses alert. The ridge couldn't be far. I wanted to get there, set up camp, and put my back against something solid. The light faded as I climbed the last stretch. My legs burned, my throat was dry, but finally the ground leveled out. The trees opened, and I was there. The ridge stretched wide, the land dropping away on both sides. I could see for miles. The sun was just above the horizon, turning the sky orange and red. For a moment, the beauty of it all almost drowned out my unease. Almost. I set my pack down near a cluster of rocks, my hands shaking as I unrolled my gear. I worked quickly, not wanting to be caught in full dark without shelter. My tent went up, my sleeping bag spread inside. I boiled water for a simple meal, the smell of it rising in the cool air. I ate quickly, not tasting much. Then the night came. The temperature dropped fast, and I pulled on my jacket. The forest below turned into a sea of shadows. The sky darkened until only the stars shone. The silence was heavy. That was when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, somewhere beyond the edge of the ridge. I froze, my heart pounding so loud it filled my ears. I held my breath, listening. The steps crunched on loose dirt, stopped, then started again. They weren't close, not yet, but they were there. I sat there for what felt like hours, the night pressing in, the sound coming and going. I thought about calling out, but the words stuck in my throat. I thought about grabbing my pack and moving, but where would I go? Down into the dark forest? Blind? Instead, I stayed still. I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I sat against the rocks, staring out into the night, every muscle tense. The steps never came close enough for me to see who it was. But they didn't leave either. They circled, faded, came back, over and over. By the time the first light touched the horizon, I was shaking with exhaustion. My eyes burned, my body stiff. I packed up quickly, not even bothering to eat. I just wanted to get off the ridge. The trail down felt different in daylight. I moved fast, too fast, stumbling sometimes, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. I didn't stop for breaks, barely drank water. My legs screamed, but I pushed them harder. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing where I had first looked out over the hills. My chest eased when I saw it. I was getting closer. I could almost taste safety. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, pressed deep into the dirt of the trail, were boot prints, fresh again, leading the same way I was going. I don't remember much after that, not clearly. I remember running, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, my breath tearing in my throat. I remember the trees blurring past, the sound of branches snapping somewhere behind me. I didn't stop until I saw the glint of metal through the trees, the roof of a car in the parking lot. When I finally stumbled out onto the asphalt, my knees gave out. I sat there, shaking, gasping for air, the world spinning. I had planned the hike for weeks. The idea came to me during a slow afternoon at work, when I was staring at maps online and thinking about how trapped I felt in the office. I wanted a place that was quiet, away from people, where I could walk for hours without hearing anything but the sound of wind and leaves. I found a long backcountry trail about 4 hours from home. It wasn't very well known, and that was what drew me in. I wanted something raw, something that felt like it belonged to me for a while. The trail cut through deep woods, old ridges, and followed a narrow river for several miles. I read a few trip reports online, but most of them were vague. People mentioned that it wasn't marked well in some places, and that you had to watch your footing along the river. I convinced myself that those warnings were part of the appeal. I packed carefully. I brought extra food, water, my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and the kind of survival kit people always say to bring but rarely need: compass, first aid kit, water filter, knife. I double-checked everything because I told myself I wouldn't make mistakes like other hikers I read about. The morning I left, the air felt heavy but calm. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that doesn't look dangerous yet but hints that it could turn ugly later. I drove the long stretch of highway with music playing low, then turned off onto the smaller road that twisted through hills and forests. My cell service dropped almost immediately. That gave me a rush of nervous energy, but I ignored it and told myself that was what I came here for. At the trailhead, there were only 2 cars. I parked near the edge, tightened the straps on my pack, and started walking. The first part of the trail was wide, soft dirt with fallen leaves packed into it. The air was cooler under the trees, damp, with that smell of soil and moss that never changes no matter where you are. I felt strong in the beginning, moving quickly, feeling each step as a release from the routine of daily life. The woods closed in around me, and the sound of the road faded until it was gone. All I heard was the creak of my pack and the crunch of my boots. I tried to listen for birds, but even they seemed quiet. As the hours went by, the trail narrowed. Roots crossed it like veins, and rocks pushed up through the dirt. I had to place my feet carefully, especially when I reached the first slope that led down toward the river. The ground was soft in places, wet from earlier rains, and I almost slipped more than once. When I finally reached the bottom, I saw the river running quick and dark beside me. It wasn't very wide, but it moved with a force that made me uneasy. The trail followed the river for miles. It twisted and bent, sometimes pulling away into the woods before curving back close to the water. I stopped once to eat a snack and sat on a log. That was when I first noticed how still the air had become. The wind had dropped completely, and the gray sky seemed lower now. I told myself it was fine, but a small knot of worry formed in me. I pushed on. By late afternoon, the forest grew darker. The clouds had thickened, and I knew I needed to find a spot to set up camp before it rained. I finally found a small clearing a little uphill from the river. It was uneven, but flat enough for my tent. I dropped my pack, stretched out my shoulders, and started setting up. As I drove the stakes into the ground, I heard something crack in the woods behind me. Not just a twig underfoot. It was heavier, like something stepping down hard. My body froze. I turned slowly, staring into the trees. Everything looked the same: shadows, trunks, layers of brush. I held my breath, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep working. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just a branch falling. Still, my hands moved faster, fumbling a little as I finished the tent and pulled my gear inside. I cooked quickly, a small flame from the stove, and ate without really tasting anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the woods. When the rain started, it came hard. It hammered the tent in waves, drowning out every other sound. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the constant rush of water hitting nylon. I tried to tell myself it was cozy, that I was safe in here, but my mind kept drifting back to that sharp crack in the woods. I must have slept a few hours, because when I opened my eyes again, it was the dead of night. The rain had stopped, but everything was dripping. The silence was thick. Then I heard it, the sound of steps in wet leaves. Slow, deliberate. They moved past the edge of my tent, so close I could feel myself holding my breath again. Whoever it was, they didn't speak. They didn't shine a light, just steady steps moving through the clearing, then fading back into the trees. I didn't sleep again. I lay there until the first gray light of morning seeped through the tent. When I finally crawled out, the ground around the tent was soaked. I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting, looking for footprints. The wet soil held marks, but they could have been anything. Animal, water dripping, even mine from the day before. Still, my skin prickled as I packed up my things. I decided to keep going instead of turning back. I told myself I was just spooked and that I'd feel better once I got deeper into the hike. The trail became harder that day. The river narrowed into sharp bends, the banks steep and slick. I slipped once, my boots sliding into the water, soaking it through. The cold bit into my foot, but I kept moving, afraid to stop too long. Hours went by, and I barely saw any sign of other people. No rappers, no prints, nothing. It was like no one had been here for weeks. I passed through stretches of woods so dense the light barely touched the ground. The silence pressed in until I could hear my own heartbeat. Late that afternoon, I saw something that stopped me cold. On a patch of soft mud near the river was a boot print. Fresh. The edges were sharp, not washed by rain. It wasn't mine. I checked the tread against my own, and it didn't match. Someone else was out here, close enough that I was walking in their tracks. I kept moving, but every sound behind me made me twitch. A branch snapping, leaves shifting. It all felt like it was tied to that print. I wanted to believe it was just another hiker, but the memory of those footsteps around my tent wouldn't leave me. When I finally set up camp again, I forced myself to climb a little higher onto a ridge, away from the river. I cleared an area between thick trees and pitched my tent there. I ate quickly again, never fully relaxing, then crawled inside before the sun even disappeared. That night, the noise came back. Not rain this time, not animals. Steps again, slower, closer. I held my knife in my hand inside the tent, my arm aching from keeping it tight. The steps circled, stopping sometimes as if whoever it was had crouched down just outside. My chest tightened until I felt dizzy. Then, just as before, the sound drifted away into the woods. By morning, I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone was following me. The rest of the hike became a blur of fear and exhaustion. Every mile felt heavier. My pack dug into my shoulders. My feet blistered, but I couldn't stop. I kept looking back down the trail, expecting to see someone. The woods never gave me a clear answer, only flickers of movement that vanished when I stared too hard. At one point, I thought I heard breathing behind me. I spun, but the trail was empty. My hands shook as I gripped the straps of my pack. When I finally reached the last stretch near the trailhead, my body nearly gave out from relief. The woods thinned, and I saw the faint line of road through the trees. My car waited there like a lifeline. But when I stepped into the clearing, my stomach dropped. The other two cars that had been parked beside mine on the first day were still there, but both had their windows smashed. Shards of glass littered the ground. One car door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I froze, scanning the tree line. It was quiet, too quiet. I hurried to my car, my heart racing. I unlocked it, threw my pack inside, and started the engine with shaking hands. The sound of the motor roared in the silence. I pulled out fast, gravel crunching under the tires, and didn't slow until I was miles down the road. I never saw who it was. I never saw a face, never heard a voice. But I know someone followed me through those woods. Someone who came close enough to circle my tent at night, who left prints behind, who lingered in silence just out of sight. For days after, I couldn't sleep without hearing those steps in my head. I kept imagining the sound of them moving through wet leaves, deliberate and steady, always closing in, never rushing, like they knew I had nowhere else to go. I finished the hike alive, but it didn't feel like I won anything. It felt like I escaped, barely, from something I was never meant to meet. I had planned the trip for months, thinking it would be a simple 2-day hike into the hills. Nothing extreme, just something to clear my mind and spend time in the quiet. I wasn't looking for anything dangerous or life-threatening, just a chance to get away from the noise of the city and walk under tall trees with nothing but the sound of wind and birds. I told myself it would be a break from everything. I packed light, thinking that was the smart thing to do, because the hike wasn't supposed to be long and I didn't want to weigh myself down. Looking back now, I realized that was my first mistake. The trail I chose wasn't one of the most popular ones. I had read about it on a forum where people shared hidden hiking spots, places that weren't full of crowds and families with coolers. That was exactly what I wanted: quiet, solitude, something that felt untouched. It was described as moderate with some steep climbs, but nothing that required ropes or technical skills. Supposedly, there was an old fire lookout at the top of the ridge, and from there the view stretched for miles in every direction. That was my goal. I imagined standing there by myself, watching the sun go down, and feeling like I had found something special. I left early in the morning, parking my car at the small pull-off near the start of the trail. There wasn't much there, just a faded wooden sign with the trail's name carved into it and some stickers peeling off from years of weather. No one else was parked nearby, which gave me a strange sense of ownership over the place, like it was mine alone. The air was cool when I started, the ground still damp with dew, and the forest was thick with pine. It smelled sharp and earthy, and I felt good as I set out. At first, the trail was clear and easy to follow. It wound through the trees in gentle switchbacks, climbing steadily but not too steep. I noticed birds flitting between branches, heard the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The sun started breaking through the trees as the morning went on, scattering beams of light across the ground. I stopped once or twice to drink water and take in the quiet, and I thought about how lucky I was to be there alone. But as the hours passed, the trail started to change. It narrowed, grew less defined. Fallen branches and rocks blocked sections of it, and I found myself stepping over or around obstacles more often. In some places, grass had grown over the dirt, making it harder to see where the path actually was. I told myself it was fine, that I just had to pay attention, but I felt the first hint of unease in my stomach. Trails don't just disappear, I thought. People must hike this, even if not often. So I pushed on, telling myself I'd be at the lookout soon. The slope grew steeper as I climbed higher. My legs burned, sweat ran down my back, and I started to feel the weight of my pack in a way I hadn't before. I stopped to eat a snack, sitting on a fallen log, and when I looked around I realized how dense the trees had become. The light barely made it through in places, and the air felt still. It was quiet in a way that made me suddenly aware of how far I was from anyone else. No voices, no distant hum of cars, just silence broken by the occasional snap of a twig. I chewed slowly, forcing myself not to think about it. When I stood up to continue, I realized I couldn't see the trail clearly anymore. I had stepped off it to sit down, and now the ground all looked the same. Pine needles, scattered rocks, patches of moss. I turned one way, then another, searching for the worn dirt that had been guiding me, but nothing stood out. My chest tightened as I walked a few steps in one direction, then stopped, unsure if I was making it worse. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but of course there was no signal. The offline map I had downloaded only showed a general outline of the area, not enough detail to tell me where exactly I was. I told myself not to panic. Trails are never far from each other. If I just kept moving uphill, I'd reach the ridge, and from there I could reorient myself. So I picked a direction that seemed right and kept climbing. The ground grew rougher, with loose rocks and roots that caught my boots. I had to use my hands to steady myself at times, grabbing at tree trunks to keep from slipping. My breathing grew harsh, and my throat felt dry even though I had been sipping water. An hour passed like that, maybe more. I couldn't tell anymore. The forest all looked the same, and I didn't find the trail again. Instead, the ground suddenly dropped away ahead of me, opening into a steep slope covered in loose shale. I stopped at the edge, looking down at the sharp incline that seemed to go on forever. Going down would be dangerous, but going around would take time I wasn't sure I had. The sun had started to tilt in the sky, and the light was changing, growing weaker. I decided to skirt the slope, moving along the edge where the ground was firmer. I moved slowly, planting each step carefully, but at one point the dirt crumbled beneath me and I slipped. My knee smashed against a rock, sending a jolt of pain through my leg, and I slid a few feet before catching myself on a branch. My heart pounded as I clung there, the ground far below me. When I finally pulled myself back up, I sat shaking, checking my knee. The skin was scraped raw and bleeding, but nothing seemed broken. Still, every step after that sent a dull ache up my leg, and I realized how much more fragile the situation had become. By the time I cleared the slope, the sun was sinking fast. The forest grew darker with each passing minute, shadows stretching long between the trees. I knew I needed to find a place to stop, but I hadn't brought much for overnight. Just a lightweight tarp, a thin blanket, and some food. I had counted on reaching the lookout and maybe even coming back down the next day. The thought of spending the night alone out there with no trail in sight made my stomach twist, but I had no choice. I found a small clearing between some rocks where the ground was relatively flat. I set down my pack and tried to make it feel like a camp. I strung the tarp between two branches, laid my blanket underneath, and sat with my back against my pack. The forest was almost completely dark now, and the sounds changed. Birds quieted, replaced by the faint rustling of things moving unseen. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every sound of leaves shifting made me imagine something watching me. I ate a small handful of food, not because I was hungry, but because I knew I needed the energy. The night dragged on endlessly. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I would hear something. Maybe a branch breaking in the distance, maybe just the wind, and my eyes would snap open again. My knee throbbed, my back ached against the hard ground, and the cold crept in under the thin blanket. I shivered, curling tighter, telling myself morning would come. But it felt like it never would. When the sky finally began to lighten, I pushed myself up, stiff and exhausted. My throat was dry, and I realized how quickly my water supply was shrinking. I had brought enough for what I thought would be a short trip, but now, lost and moving slowly, it wasn't nearly enough. I knew I had to find my way back as soon as possible. I decided to head downhill, reasoning that trails usually start near lower ground, and maybe I'd find water along the way too. The descent was worse than the climb. My knee protested with every step, and the terrain was rough. At one point, I heard the rush of water and felt a surge of relief. I followed the sound until I found a narrow stream cutting through the rocks. I knelt and drank deeply, the cold water easing the dryness in my throat. I refilled my bottle, telling myself I'd be okay now, at least for a while. But when I stood, I noticed tracks in the mud nearby. Not boots, paws. Large, heavy. My chest tightened as I stared at them. They looked fresh. I scanned the trees, heart hammering, but saw nothing. Still, the knowledge that something big was out there with me didn't leave my mind. I kept moving, trying to follow the stream, thinking it might lead me to a road or at least closer to civilization. Hours passed. The forest shifted around me, sometimes opening into sparse clearings, sometimes closing in so tightly I had to push through branches. My legs felt heavy, and hunger gnawed at me, but I forced myself on. I kept listening, always listening, for footsteps behind me, for anything out of place. Once I swore I heard something moving parallel to me, hidden in the trees, but when I stopped, the sound stopped too. I stood there, barely breathing, until I forced myself to keep walking. The second night came before I was ready. This time I didn't bother with a tarp. I just found a spot against a large boulder and huddled there, pulling the blanket around me. My stomach cramped with hunger, but I rationed my food, eating only a little. The sounds of the forest felt louder now, closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point I thought I heard something sniffing in the dark, close enough that I held my breath, gripping a rock in my hand like it could save me. The sound faded, but I didn't sleep after that. Morning came gray and cold. My body felt weak, my mind clouded. I knew I couldn't last much longer without finding the trail or some sign of people. I pushed myself up, every movement aching, and kept walking. I had been planning the hike for months. I had gone on long hikes before, but this time I wanted to test myself in a way I never had. I wanted to hike a trail that stretched over 50 miles through forest, mountain ridges, and deep valleys, carrying everything I needed on my back and camping along the way. It wasn't the longest trail out there, but it was remote, and I wanted that feeling of being cut off from everything. No phone service, no city noise, just me and the trail. The day I started, the morning air was cold and heavy with mist. My pack was heavier than it should have been, but I told myself I would get used to it once I warmed up. The first section was easy, almost too easy, like a warm-up lap. Wide paths, markers nailed to trees every few hundred feet, and the sound of birds echoing through the forest. Felt good, and I walked faster than I should have. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and I could feel the damp earth through the soles of my boots. I liked it. It made me feel close to the trail. By the time I stopped for lunch, I had already gone farther than planned. My legs were sore, but I ignored it. I had brought simple food, nuts, jerky, and a tortilla wrapped around cheese. It wasn't much, but it gave me the energy to keep going. I sat on a log for a while, listening. The forest had its own voice, a creak of trees in the wind, the sharp sound of a woodpecker hammering somewhere unseen, the soft scurry of something small moving through the leaves. I didn't feel uneasy yet, but I noticed that the deeper I went, the quieter it became. Less bird noise, less wind even, almost like the air itself was thicker. The trail narrowed after that point. It was no longer a wide path, but more of a track pressed into the earth. Branches brushed against my pack, and I had to duck under fallen logs. The trees grew closer together, tall and dark, blocking much of the light. I felt like I had stepped into a different world. I kept going, checking the map I had folded in my pocket. I knew I had to reach a small stream where I could refill my water before nightfall. That was my first goal. The stream came later than I thought it would. I almost worried I had passed it, but then I heard the trickle of running water through the still air. Relief washed over me when I saw it. I knelt down and filtered water into my bottle. My knees cracked as I stood again, reminding me of the weight I was carrying. The sun was lower by then, streaks of orange light hitting the tops of the trees while the forest floor grew darker and darker. I knew I had to stop soon. I found a small flat spot a few hundred feet off the trail and set up camp. The tent went up easily, and I lit a small stove to heat some food. I ate slowly, watching the shadows stretch between the trees. By the time I lay down, the forest had gone silent again. I thought I would fall asleep fast after all the walking, but it didn't come easy. I lay there listening. At first it was nothing, but then came little cracks, like twigs breaking under weight. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the nylon of my tent. My heart hammered. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling of the tent, gripping my knife that I kept by my side. Minutes passed, then silence again. I told myself it was a deer, maybe just the wind. I forced my eyes shut and eventually drifted off. The second day was harder. My legs burned the moment I started moving, and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders. The trail climbed steeply up a ridge, and I could feel sweat soaking into my shirt. The higher I went, the rougher it got. The trail disappeared in places, forcing me to scramble over rock and roots. When I finally reached the top, the view should have been beautiful mountains rolling off into the distance, thick forest covering everything. But I only felt how far away I was from anyone else. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. Pressed down on me, I descended the other side, moving slower than before. At one point, I nearly slipped on loose dirt, my heart racing as I caught myself on a branch. The ground was damp, slick in places where water seeped down from the ridge above. My boots grew heavy with mud. I pushed forward, stopping only to drink and chew on more jerky. I told myself I would rest longer when I reached the bottom, near another stream marked on the map. When I finally reached it, I was exhausted. I knelt down, splashing cold water on my face, drinking deeply. I filled both bottles, knowing the next stretch would be dry. My legs trembled as I stood. I wanted to stop there, but the ground was swampy and flat. Mosquitoes swarmed around me, biting through my shirt. I forced myself onward until I found another small clearing. That night was worse. I built a fire this time, small but enough to give me light. The darkness beyond the circle of flames felt alive. My ears strained at every sound. A snap in the distance, a rustle close by. My heart thudded so hard it was all I could hear. I wanted to believe it was animals, but something about it didn't feel right. I sat with my knife in my hand again, barely touching my food. I don't know how long I stayed awake before finally crawling into my tent. I pulled the zipper tight and lay still, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Somewhere in the night, I woke to the sound of movement again. Not just a crack this time, but steady steps. I held my breath, eyes wide open though it was black inside the tent. The steps came closer, crunching leaves, circling. My hand gripped the knife. My throat was dry. I wanted to yell out, but fear held me down. The steps paused just outside. I could hear my heart beating louder than anything. Then, slowly, they moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, not daring to move. When morning came, I packed fast and left, barely eating. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe it had been a deer or a bear, curious about the smell of food. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound made me snap my head around. I kept my knife tucked into my belt instead of in my pack. I walked faster, pushing my body harder than I should have. The trail blurred beneath me as hours passed. Around midday, I noticed something strange. A footprint in the mud. Not mine. Not an animal's either. It was a boot print. Fresh. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen anyone since I started. This trail wasn't popular, and the print looked like it had been made that morning. I looked around, but the trees closed in on all sides. I couldn't see anyone. I kept moving faster now, but every so often, I saw another print. Sometimes on the trail, sometimes just off it, like someone had stepped into the brush. I didn't know if they were ahead of me or behind me. I only knew I wasn't alone. The hours dragged. My shoulders ached, and my lips cracked from thirst. I stopped at the next stream, drank quickly, and pressed on. I wanted distance. Distance from whoever was out there. I didn't stop to eat properly. I shoved food into my mouth as I walked, barely tasting it. My stomach cramped from the pace, but I didn't care. The forest felt tighter, darker. I swore I could hear something moving behind me at times, just faint, but always stopping when I stopped. By late afternoon, I could barely walk straight. My legs were shaking, my feet blistered. I had to stop. I found a hollow near a thick cluster of trees and set up my tent in a rush. I didn't light a fire this time. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, chewing on a piece of dry bread, my hands shaking, my ears strained, waiting. The silence was worse now because I knew I wasn't imagining it anymore. Someone was out there. When I finally crawled into the tent, I didn't sleep. Hours passed in a blur of fear. At some point, I heard it again. Steps. Closer this time. No hesitation. They circled the tent once. I froze, every muscle tight. I could hear the crunch of leaves inches away. My throat burned. My body shaking so hard I thought the noise would give me away. Then silence. Minutes stretched. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the knife into my chest, gripping it hard, and stayed that way until morning light crept in. I stumbled out of the tent at dawn, my body stiff and weak. My eyes scanned the ground. The prints were there, clear, human. Whoever it was had stood just outside my tent. My stomach twisted. I packed fast and ran down the trail, tripping, gasping for air. I didn't stop. My body screamed at me to rest, but I couldn't. Not here. Not until I was out. The last miles blurred into pain and fear. My water was gone, my legs numb, but I kept moving. Every sound made me flinch. I didn't dare look back. When I finally saw the end of the trail, the small gravel parking lot where I had left my car, my chest nearly collapsed with relief. My legs almost gave out as I stumbled to the car, fumbling with the keys. I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands shook so hard I could barely turn the engine. I drove until I reached the nearest town, hours away. Only I had been planning that hike for weeks, maybe even months. It wasn't some famous trail that people flocked to for weekend trips. It was a quieter one, the kind of trail that didn't have big signs or brochures about it. I had found it almost by accident while looking through some old maps and trip reports online. The name of it barely came up, and when it did, the comments were short, vague, and usually mentioned how it was overgrown, hard to follow, and not worth the effort. That kind of description only made me more interested. I liked hikes that weren't crowded. I wanted something that felt untouched, something where I wouldn't be dodging families, dogs, or joggers. I wanted silence, woods, and space to move at my own pace. The day I set out was early in September. The air was already starting to lose its summer heaviness, and there was a sharpness to it when I breathed in. I left my car at a small dirt pull-off on the side of an unmarked road. There wasn't a trailhead sign, just a faint gap between trees where a path seemed to push through. Grass grew high along the edges, and branches bent low, as if no one had brushed them aside in a long time. I checked my backpack again. Water, food, extra clothes, flashlight, first aid kit, compass, printed map, knife, and some rope. I had learned the hard way not to underestimate even the shortest hike. I carried more than I probably needed, but I preferred it that way. My boots were tied tight, and I stepped forward into the trees. The trail was faint but visible. It wound through thick brush, with thorns snagging my clothes now and then. The morning light cut through in long beams, catching dust in the air. At first, it felt like the kind of quiet that makes you relax. I could hear birds, the wind pushing against leaves, and my own steady breath. My legs felt strong, my pace quick. For the first hour, the hike was what I expected, mildly difficult, narrow, but not confusing. Then the path began to fade. What had been a dirt track became broken patches of ground between roots. I followed it carefully, scanning ahead for any sign of direction. I had my map folded in my jacket pocket, but the map wasn't much help. It was old and barely showed details of the land. It had one thick red line for the trail, but on the ground that line meant nothing. I kept pushing forward. The trees grew closer together, pine and oak, the smell of resin and damp soil thick in the air. At times, the light dimmed enough that I felt like I was hours closer to evening than I really was. The deeper I went, the less I saw of animals. Birds went quiet. Even the buzzing of insects seemed to thin out until the woods felt still, like they were holding their breath. I tried not to think much about it. Trails like this could be like that. Animals moved elsewhere, or maybe I was just too focused to notice. I pressed on, climbing over fallen logs slick with moss, ducking under branches. Sweat rolled down my back despite the cool air. At one point, I came to what looked like an old wooden post. It was broken, leaning sideways in the dirt. The wood was gray, almost rotting. I brushed leaves away with my boot and saw the faint outline of carved letters, weathered down so much they were unreadable. A trail marker, probably from decades back. It made me feel both reassured and uneasy at the same time. Reassured because it meant I was on some path, uneasy because it showed just how forgotten this place was. I moved on. The ground sloped upward. My thighs burned as I climbed, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on rocks slick with damp moss. The air cooled further as I gained height, and patches of fog clung low in shaded areas. The trail almost disappeared entirely more than once, but I pushed ahead in the direction I thought was right. Each time I second-guessed myself, I would stop, take a breath, and look around for any sign of disturbed ground or a broken branch. It took longer than I liked, but eventually I would find a trace of where people had once walked. After about 4 hours, I realized I hadn't eaten. I sat on a fallen log and pulled out a sandwich, drinking deep from my water bottle. The woods around me were so quiet I could hear every chew, every swallow. I didn't sit long, though. Something about being still too long there felt wrong. I couldn't explain why. I packed up and kept moving. The higher I climbed, the rougher it became. The dirt gave way to rock. The trail cut across narrow ledges with steep drops below. My boots scraped stone, and I kept one hand against the rock wall beside me for balance. The trees thinned, and for the first time I had a view beyond them. Rolling hills stretching for miles, green fading into blue in the distance. It should have been beautiful, and in a way it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being too far out, too far from anything. The trail twisted again into thicker woods, darker than before. The sun had shifted by then, hanging lower, the light more golden. But in those trees it felt like dusk. I started to think about how far I had gone. I hadn't seen a single person all day. That was what I had wanted, but now it sat heavy in my stomach. When the path split, I stopped cold. One way sloped downward, narrow, littered with leaves. The other cut upward through rocks, looking rougher but clearer. My map didn't show any split. I crouched, studying the ground. The downward path looked softer, with more debris. The upward one had stones scraped bare, like boots or shoes had scuffed it more often. I chose upward. The climb was hard. My calves burned, lungs tight, sweat cooling quick against my skin. I gripped roots to haul myself up. At one point I slipped, my knee slamming against stone, but I caught myself before sliding. I paused, breathing hard, rubbing the sting away. I told myself I needed to be more careful. One bad fallout here and I wouldn't have helped. The trail flattened suddenly, and I came to a clearing. Grass grew tall there, and in the center stood what looked like the remains of an old fire ring. Stones blackened and broken. I stood over it, staring. It had been years since anyone had burned anything there, but it was proof people had once camped in that very spot. The idea made my chest tighten. They had camped there, but why had the place been abandoned? Forgotten? I didn't stay long. The sky was shifting colors, orange bleeding into purple. I knew I couldn't keep going without risking being caught in full dark. I pulled my pack off and began clearing a space under some trees at the edge of the clearing. I set up my small tent quickly, my hands moving faster than my mind wanted them to. I kept listening, waiting for some sound of wildlife, but the silence pressed in heavy. I boiled water on my small stove, the hiss of the flame loud in the stillness. I ate a hot meal, though I barely tasted it. My eyes kept flicking toward the trees, expecting movement that never came. When the sky finally darkened, I crawled into my tent. Inside, I zipped the door shut, slipped into my sleeping bag, and turned off the light. I lay there in the dark, every small sound outside amplified. I heard the wind shift leaves. A branch cracked far off. My pulse thudded against my ears. I told myself it was just the forest, nothing unusual. But it felt unusual. Sleep came in fragments. I would drift, then snap awake at the sound of something faint. At one point I swore I heard steps. Slow, deliberate, crunching leaves. But when I held my breath and listened harder, nothing followed. The silence returned. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. Morning came gray, the sky heavy with low clouds. My body ached from the rough ground. I packed quickly, eager to move. I didn't eat much, just a bar stuffed in my pocket. I wanted to be moving, to be away from that clearing. I tried to follow the trail again, but it grew worse. What little path had existed seemed to vanish into thickets. I pushed through branches, scraped my arms on thorns, stumbled over uneven ground. My compass told me I was still heading in the general direction I wanted, but the land itself seemed to twist. Ridges and gullies cut across, forcing me to climb down and back up, slowing me more than I liked. By midday, I admitted to myself I wasn't sure where the trail was anymore. I tried to stay calm. I had my map, I had my compass, I had supplies. I just needed to backtrack. I turned around and began retracing my steps. But the ground didn't look the same. Trees looked too similar. Clearings I thought I recognized didn't match. I stopped, unfolded my map, and studied it again. The map might as well have been blank. Nothing on it resembled what I was standing in. The sky darkened further, clouds thickening. The air pressed damp against my skin. I felt the first drops of rain before long, cold against the back of my neck. I pulled my rain jacket from my pack and kept moving, but the rain grew heavier, pounding through leaves, turning dirt to mud. My boots slipped on slick ground. When thunder rolled, low and long, I knew I couldn't keep searching. I needed shelter. I scanned the area desperately. At last, I saw a rock outcrop, jagged but with a shallow cave beneath. I scrambled toward it, sliding more than once, and shoved myself in. I started the hike on a gray morning, the sky still covered in a heavy blanket of clouds that looked like they could break into rain at any moment. The air felt damp, and the trailhead smelled of wet earth and pine. My backpack was heavier than I liked, packed with supplies I thought I might need. Food, water, an extra jacket, flashlight, map, small first aid kit, knife, rope. I always told myself that I liked being prepared, but the weight dug into my shoulders from the very first step, making the path feel longer than it really was. The trail I had chosen was not popular. It wound deep into the forest, climbing slowly at first, then twisting into hills and rocky ground where the forest grew denser and darker. It was supposed to connect to a loop trail that came back to the road, but most people avoided it. I had read some blogs online that said the trail was rough, sometimes overgrown, not well maintained, and easy to lose if you weren't careful. That was exactly why I wanted to hike it. I liked the quiet. I liked not seeing people for hours. I liked the challenge of finding my way through places that weren't marked by signs every 100 yards. At the start, the trail was clear enough. It cut through a section of tall pines, their trunks straight and narrow, their needles covering the ground in a soft brown carpet that muffled my footsteps. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint sound of wind moving through branches and the occasional creak of a tree. I walked slowly, my body still warming up, trying to shake off the stiffness from the long drive that morning. The ground was damp from a rainstorm the night before, and my boots sank slightly into soft soil. I noticed small paw prints along the trail, probably from a raccoon or fox. Deer tracks too, leading into the brush. I felt comforted by those signs of wildlife, even though I knew that bigger animals roamed these woods. Black bears had been seen in the area, and though attacks were rare, the thought of crossing paths with one always sat in the back of my mind. After about an hour, the trail narrowed and began to climb. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting overhead, shutting out more of the gray light from the sky. The air cooled noticeably, and the dampness clung to my clothes. I stopped to pull on a light jacket. My backpack straps pinched into my shoulders as I shrugged it on, and for a moment I regretted how much I had packed. The path was uneven, covered in roots and rocks. Each step took more effort, and I found myself watching the ground carefully to avoid tripping. The forest felt thicker here, quieter too. The deeper I went, the less I could hear from outside. No distant cars, no airplanes overhead, not even the sound of wind at times. Just the crunch of my boots, the sound of my breathing, and sometimes the faint scurry of something small darting through undergrowth. I reached a section where the trail seemed to split. The map I had printed showed only one main path, but on the ground, there were faint signs of other routes, maybe old logging roads or animal paths. The main trail looked less obvious now, almost swallowed by weeds and brush. I hesitated, staring down at the map, trying to match landmarks. There was a creek somewhere nearby, but I couldn't hear water. I trusted my instinct and pushed through the more overgrown path. It was harder than I expected. Branches scratched at my jacket, ferns tangled around my legs, and the ground turned muddy in spots where water had pooled. My boots sank with wet sucking sounds, and I had to balance carefully not to slip. The air smelled stronger here, a mix of rotting leaves and wet wood, the kind of smell that told you this part of the forest didn't see many people. I checked my watch, 2 hours in. My legs already felt heavy. I hadn't seen a single person since I started. No hikers, no signs of recent use. It made me uneasy, though part of me enjoyed the solitude. I pressed on, telling myself the loop would appear soon enough. Another hour passed, and I realized I might have taken the wrong turn. The trail disappeared completely in sections, forcing me to look for broken branches, faint depressions in the ground, anything that might hint where others had walked before. My confidence started to fade. I pulled the map out again, but nothing matched what I saw around me. No creek, no ridge, just endless forest pressing in on all sides. The ground began to slope upward, and I climbed, thinking maybe I would get a better view from higher ground. My thighs burned with the effort, sweat dampened my shirt, and every time I stopped to rest, the silence of the forest wrapped around me like a blanket. I chewed on a protein bar, washed it down with lukewarm water, and kept going. At the top, I expected to see some kind of clearing or at least a sense of direction. Instead, the trees stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills covered in thick green and brown. The sky above had darkened more, and I knew rain wasn't far off. My stomach tightened. I needed to find the real trail again before that happened. I started downhill on the other side, moving quickly, hoping I would stumble onto a clearer path. But the forest only grew rougher. Thick brush scratched at my legs, and the slope was slippery with loose soil and wet leaves. Halfway down, I slipped, falling hard onto my side, my backpack breaking the fall. Pain shot through my ribs, and I lay there for a moment, gasping. Nothing felt broken, but the shock rattled me. I stood slowly, brushed myself off, and adjusted the pack. My hands shook a little. I realized then how alone I was. No one knew exactly where I had gone. If I got hurt badly, if I couldn't move, I would just lie there in the dirt until someone stumbled across me by chance. That thought stuck in my head as I kept moving. Rain started in the late afternoon. It wasn't heavy at first, just a drizzle, but soon it turned steady, soaking through the canopy and dripping onto me. My jacket held up for a while, but eventually the water found its way in. My boots squelched with each step. The trail, if it could even be called that anymore, became slick and treacherous. I kept glancing at my map, but the paper was softening from the damp, the ink smudging. My compass needle shook with each movement, but it was the only thing I trusted now. I tried to follow a direction I thought would lead back to the road, but the forest twisted in ways that made me second-guess myself constantly. As the rain fell harder, daylight began to fade faster than I expected. The sky turned a dim, colorless gray, then sank into gloom. I pulled out my flashlight earlier than I wanted to, its beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the trees. I hated relying on it so soon, but without it, I would have stumbled over every root and rock. The forest changed at night. Every sound carried differently. The drip of rainwater, the snap of branches, the rustle of unseen animals moving through undergrowth. My nerves sharpened with each noise. I forced myself to keep calm, reminding myself these were normal forest sounds. But deep inside, fear gnawed at me. Hours passed. My body ached from walking. My shoulders throbbed from the weight of the pack, and hunger clawed at my stomach. I stopped under a cluster of trees that gave slightly better shelter and decided to make a small camp for the night. I spread out a tarp, sat down, and tried to eat something dry from my pack. The rain pattered overhead, steady and endless. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something move nearby. Sometimes it was just the wind, but other times it was heavier, like steps crunching on wet leaves. I held my knife close, heart pounding, even though I told myself it was just deer or maybe a bear passing through. Still, the fear of being alone, deep in a place I couldn't escape, kept me awake most of the night. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest dripping and quiet. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around tree trunks. My body was stiff and cold, my clothes damp, my skin clammy. I packed up slowly, dreading the day ahead, but I knew I couldn't sit there. I had to keep moving. The second day blurred into a long, exhausting fight against the forest. My sense of direction faltered more and more. I tried to use the compass, but the terrain forced me to go around obstacles. Fallen trees, ravines, thick underbrush, so often that I lost any straight path. Water wasn't an issue. Small streams and puddles were everywhere. But food was running low and my energy with it. That evening, when the sun dipped again, I finally admitted to myself that I was lost. Really lost. Panic built in my chest, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to panic. I set up another rough camp, smaller this time, no fire because I was too tired and too afraid of drawing attention. The darkness closed in quickly, and I sat in silence, knife in hand, listening to the forest move around me. The third day was worse. My legs trembled with each step, and every muscle screamed. My pack felt twice as heavy. I tripped often, scraping my knees and hands. My water filter clogged from muddy runoff, forcing me to drink less. Hunger was a constant ache now, gnawing at me with I had been planning a long solo hike for months, studying maps, checking the gear I had, and going over every possible small thing that could go wrong. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't a professional either. I had done plenty of weekend trips, some overnight stays, and a couple of multi-day hikes with friends. What I wanted this time was something different, something that would push me further than I had gone before. I chose an area I had never visited before, a large forest that stretched into a series of old hills with narrow valleys, rivers, and forgotten trails that were not often used anymore. The idea was to spend 3 nights out there, carry everything I needed, and follow a trail that looped through the hills before circling back to where I had parked. It looked simple on the map, a long loop that would take me deeper into the forest and then back around. What I didn't fully realize was how much could change when you left the main trail and followed paths that weren't well marked. I had read that parts of the area weren't well maintained, and that some sections could be overgrown. That should have been a warning, but I thought I could handle it. I had my GPS, a paper map, extra batteries, food, and enough water purification tablets to last me longer than I would need. The first day went as I expected. The weather was good, cool air with a mix of clouds and sun. The forest was quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth. The trail started off wide and clear, the kind of path you could follow without even looking down. I walked for hours, stopping every now and then to drink or take a small snack out of my pack. My boots crunched over fallen leaves, and the air smelled damp and earthy. As I went deeper, the trail began to narrow. Branches hung low, brushing against my pack, and the sound of the road I had left hours earlier was completely gone. By the afternoon, I felt like I was in another world, separated from everything. It was the kind of silence that made you listen harder, as if the forest wanted you to notice every snap of a twig or flap of a bird's wings. When I set up camp that first night, it felt normal. I found a flat space off the trail, cleared some branches, and set up my small tent. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and lay back listening to the quiet. There were the usual night sounds, crickets, owls, something moving through leaves now and then. It was nothing that made me nervous. I slept well that night, which is rare for me when I'm out alone. The second day started out the same. I packed everything up, checked my map, and kept going. The path kept narrowing, and I noticed fewer and fewer signs that people had been there recently. Grass and weeds grew right across the trail, and in some places fallen branches forced me to climb over or crawl under. It slowed me down more than I thought it would. I kept checking my GPS to make sure I was still on the right track, and for the most part one was. But somewhere around the middle of that second day, I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. One path looked slightly more used, the other almost invisible, just a faint break in the grass leading into thick trees. I chose the more visible path, assuming it was the main loop. It didn't take long before I realized something was off. The trail got rougher, steeper, and then it started to disappear into rocky ground. My GPS still showed me moving in the general direction I needed to go, but the trail itself was gone. I thought about turning back, but the slope was steep and going down seemed harder than continuing up. So I pushed forward, climbing carefully, grabbing trees for balance. After half an hour of this, I expected to find the trail again, but instead I reached a ridge with no clear sign of where the path had gone. I checked my map again, but the paper didn't show this ridge at all. I was off trail now, and I knew it. That was the first time I felt the knot of unease in my stomach. Being off trail is one of the worst feelings for a hiker, because even with a GPS, things can go wrong quickly. Batteries die, signals get weak, maps don't line up with what's in front of you. I decided to keep moving forward, thinking I would meet up with the loop again on the other side of the ridge. The ridge led me into thicker woods, darker and quieter than before. The ground was soft with moss, and everything felt damp. My boots sank into the earth, and I had to slow down to avoid slipping. It became harder to tell where I was going because the trees blocked so much of the sky. I tried to follow the direction my GPS gave me, but it felt like I was weaving in circles. Every part of the forest looked the same: dark trunks, green moss, patches of ferns. By the time evening came, I realized I hadn't found the trail again. I stopped, set up camp in a small clearing, and forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just a detour, that I would get back on track the next morning. But as I lay in my tent, I kept thinking about how easy it was to lose direction when everything looked the same. I barely slept that night, waking up every hour to listen. The third day was worse. I packed up and tried again, walking in the direction I thought would lead me back to the loop. My GPS kept jumping around, sometimes telling me I was closer, then suddenly saying I was further away. The forest was thicker, almost like no one had been through it in years. Branches whipped across my arms, and thorn bushes caught my clothes. I kept checking the time, realizing how much slower I was moving. At one point, I came across a stream and decided to follow it downhill, thinking it might lead to a larger river or maybe even cross the trail again. The stream was shallow, the water clear and cold, but the rocks were slippery. More than once I almost fell, catching myself at the last second. The stream twisted through the forest, and I followed it for hours. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from the weight of my pack, and I could feel blisters forming on my feet. When I finally stopped to rest, I realized how alone I was. I hadn't seen another person since the first day. There were no footprints, no signs of campsites, nothing to suggest anyone had been here in a long time. The forest pressed in on me from every side, and the silence was heavy. I began to notice every sound. Every crack of a branch made me turn my head. Every rustle of leaves made me freeze. That night, setting up camp again, I felt a different kind of fear. It wasn't the normal nervousness of being alone. It was the fear of being lost, of not knowing if I would find the trail again. I ate less than usual, saving my food just in case. I didn't light a fire because I didn't want to attract anything, even though I knew there was probably no one out there. The darkness seemed thicker, the forest louder. I lay awake most of the night, clutching my knife even though I knew it wouldn't help much if something came close. By the fourth day, I admitted to myself that I was in trouble. I had enough food for maybe 3 more days if I stretched it, but my water was running low. I refilled from streams, purifying it as best as I could, but it wasn't enough to keep me from feeling weak. My map was useless now, and the GPS only gave me a false sense of control. I kept moving, but I had no idea if I was heading towards safety or deeper into the forest. The terrain became harsher, with fallen trees blocking my way and thick brush tearing at my legs. At one point, I slipped on wet ground and slid down a slope, hitting my arm hard on a rock. The pain was sharp, and for a moment I thought I had broken it. I sat there in the dirt, clutching my arm, fighting off panic. It wasn't broken, but it throbbed with every step I took afterward. That evening, I stumbled into a clearing and found something strange. There was an old fire ring made of stones, blackened with soot, half collapsed. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. There were no signs of recent life, no gear, no trash, nothing. Just the ring of stones and a rotting log nearby. It made me realize I wasn't the first person to get lost out here. Someone else had been here long ago, maybe trapped the same way I was. I stayed there that night, too tired to keep going. The ground was uneven, the air colder than before. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, shivering, listening to the endless forest around me. My thoughts kept circling back to the same fear. What if I never found my way out? The 5th day was the hardest. I woke up weak, sore, and lightheaded. I forced myself to eat a little, but my body felt heavy. I walked slower, stumbling often, using trees to keep myself upright. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching on with no change. I felt like I was walking in circles again, even though I tried to follow the sun. By the afternoon, I came across another stream, this one wider, flowing faster. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere. I walked along its edge, pushing through brush, slipping on rocks. Hours passed, and then I heard a sound that made my chest tighten. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Rushing water. I pushed forward faster, and soon I came to a river, much larger than the streams I had followed before. The water roared as it cut through the valley, white foam crashing over rocks. On the other side, through the trees, I saw something that almost didn't feel real. A dirt road. It was faint, narrow, and rough, but it was there. I felt tears sting my eyes. I had planned the hike for months. I wanted something remote, something that would push me past my comfort zone but still keep me within the limits of reason. I wasn't a beginner when it came to hiking, but I wasn't an expert either. Most of my past trips had been weekend trails, places with marked paths, other hikers, and clear signage. This time, I wanted isolation. I wanted to go where I wouldn't hear cars, where I wouldn't see another soul, where every sound I noticed came from the forest itself. I told myself it was about finding quiet, about getting away from everything for a while. In truth, I think I wanted to see how far I could go before I felt fear. I picked a stretch of trail deep in the mountains. The area was not exactly famous, which was part of the draw. It was a series of old logging paths that connected to more modern trails but twisted off into country that most people didn't bother with. The maps I bought had dotted lines where the official hiking path stopped and where the faded, abandoned ones began. It looked perfect. I packed carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food for several days, and the usual gear. Compass, maps, knife, extra layers, and first aid kit. I had my boots well broken in. The weather forecast looked stable. My plan was to hike in on a Friday morning, stay out 2 nights, and return on Sunday before dark. It seemed simple enough on paper. The first hours of hiking went smoothly. The air was crisp, the trail well marked. The trees were thick but alive with sound. Birds moving between branches, small animals darting through the undergrowth. As the sun rose higher, I could feel the warmth soaking through the canopy. My pack was heavy but manageable, and my body fell into the rhythm of walking. By noon, I had left the main trail. The dirt beneath my boots grew less defined, more broken. The plants leaned further into the path as if trying to swallow it back. At first, it was easy to follow, just an overgrown but visible cut through the woods. But every step further away from the official trail made it more uncertain. Soon the markings were gone entirely. No blazes on trees, no carved wooden signs, nothing to reassure me that I was moving in the right direction. Just faint depressions in the ground, maybe scars left from trucks decades ago. That was when the quiet began to feel different. In the official areas, even the isolated ones, there was always some background hum. Other hikers in the distance, the faint drone of cars carried over ridges, the occasional sound of an airplane. Here there was nothing but wind and the creak of trees. It was a heavy kind of silence, the sort that made me stop every so often to make sure my hearing hadn't dulled. I followed what I thought was the trail for hours, pushing through branches that slapped against my pack and boots, sinking into soft soil. The further I went, the less it looked like a trail at all. I started second-guessing every turn. I checked the map and compass, but they didn't line up neatly with what I was seeing. It was too easy to convince myself I was still on the right track. By late afternoon, the light had shifted. I hadn't reached the open clearing marked on the map where I had planned to set up camp. Instead, I was still weaving through dense forest, the trees so close together that the sky above was reduced to narrow strips of fading blue. I finally admitted I wasn't sure where I was. I forced myself to stop and pick a campsite. A small flat space by a cluster of rocks looked as good as any. I set up my tent, filtered water from a nearby stream, and ate a cold dinner. My muscles ached in that satisfying way, but my stomach churned with unease. I told myself that a night's rest would clear my head. Didn't. The next morning, I set out early. The forest looked different in the daylight, brighter but confusing. Every direction seemed possible, every gap between trees another potential trail. I checked the compass again and tried to line it up with the map. I told myself that as long as I kept heading north, I'd eventually reconnect with a marked trail. I walked for hours. The terrain grew rougher. Rocks jutted from the ground. The earth sloped up and down in steep climbs. My legs burned, and sweat soaked my shirt. I hadn't seen anything resembling a trail since morning. That was when I noticed it, the unsettling feeling of being watched. It wasn't anything I could point to, just the prickling of the skin on the back of my neck, the way I kept turning around only to find empty woods. The silence felt deeper than before. Even the birds seemed gone. I kept walking, faster now, though I knew speed meant little when I didn't know where I was going. By midday, my water bottle was almost empty. I searched for another stream but found none. The dry feeling in my throat grew heavier. Hunger was one thing, but thirst was worse. I slowed down, scanning for any sign of moisture, dark soil, animal tracks, anything. Finally, I stumbled across a trickle of water running down a slope into a shallow pool. Relief washed over me. I dropped my pack and filtered enough to drink. The cool water steadied me, but the relief was short. My hands shook as I tightened the cap, and I realized how drained I already felt after only one night. I pressed on. By late afternoon, the sky darkened with clouds I hadn't expected. The forecast had been clear, but weather in the mountains is unpredictable. Wind picked up, carrying a chill that sank through my clothes. I quickened my pace, desperate to find shelter before the storm broke. That was when I saw it. Not a cabin or anything man-made, just an old hunting blind, half collapsed, leaning against a cluster of trees. The wood was gray and splintered, nails rusting, but it offered some protection from the wind. I decided it was safer than trying to pitch the tent in the open. The storm hit fast. Rain pounded the canopy, dripping in heavy sheets. Lightning cracked, thunder rolling through the mountains. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone. I huddled inside the leaning structure, knees pulled to my chest, listening to the forest writhe in the storm. It lasted for hours. By the time it eased, darkness had already swallowed the woods. I couldn't move on in the dark without risking a fall or worse. I stayed there for the night, shivering, damp, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep. The next day, my nerves were frayed. My food supply was shrinking faster than I wanted to admit. My body ached from sleeping on splintered wood. I set out again, convinced I would find something recognizable soon. But the forest only grew thicker. The ground turned marshy in places, sucking at my boots. My socks stayed wet, rubbing blisters into my heels. Every step was harder than the last. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the feeling of being followed gnawing at me. Once, I thought I saw movement, a shape slipping between the trees, but when I froze and stared, there was nothing but dripping branches. I tried to calm myself. It was just the mind playing tricks after days alone. Still, I couldn't shake it. Every snapped twig made me flinch. Every gust of wind felt like breath on my neck. By late afternoon, exhaustion slowed me to a crawl. My legs trembled, and the pack felt twice as heavy. I knew I had to stop again. I found a patch of ground beneath a massive pine and set my tent up quickly, fingers fumbling with the poles. I ate the smallest dinner yet, rationing the food, and forced myself to drink less water than I wanted. That night was the worst yet. I woke up again and again to sounds outside, rustling, snapping branches, faint crunches in the undergrowth. I held my breath each time, listening, eyes wide in the dark. Nothing ever came close enough to see, but the noises kept me from sleep. When dawn finally came, I tore the tent down and shoved everything into the pack with shaking hands. I had to get out. The fourth day blurred together. My mind felt foggy, my body heavy. I no longer trusted the compass. I no longer trusted myself. Every ridge I climbed only revealed more endless forest. No sign of trails, no cabins, no smoke, no other humans. Midday, I tripped on a root and went sprawling. Pain shot through my knee, sharp enough to make my vision blur. I sat there for minutes, teeth clenched, trying not to panic. The knee wasn't broken, but every step afterward was agony. I pressed on anyway, couldn't stop. I couldn't stay in one place and wait. That evening, just as I felt I couldn't go on, I stumbled across a dirt road. It was overgrown but clearly man-made, wide enough for vehicles. Relief surged through me so strong I nearly cried. I followed it, limping, every step pushing me forward. It felt endless, but after what might have been hours, I saw a sign of life, a rusted gate, and beyond it, the faint shape of a cabin. My chest tightened with a mix of hope and fear. The cabin looked abandoned but intact. The windows were broken, the wood warped, but the roof was whole. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It smelled of dust and rot, but it was shelter. I dropped my pack, sat on the floor, and let the silence settle. For the first time in days, I felt like I might live. I always thought hiking alone was something I could handle. I had done a few weekend trips before, small trails, nothing extreme, and I felt like I had a good idea of what I was doing. That confidence is what pushed me into making a bad decision, one I still think about every night when I try to sleep. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip out to a remote section of mountains. I had taken time off work, packed food, water, my tent, and the usual gear. I planned to be gone 3 days, hiking a loop trail that climbed up into the ridges, wrapped around the valley, and then circled back to the trailhead. The map showed it as moderate difficulty. It wasn't the most popular route, and that was part of why I chose it. I wanted quiet, I wanted space, and I wanted to test myself a little. The first day was fine. The weather was cool, the air sharp and clean, the forest alive with color as the leaves were beginning to turn. I walked at a steady pace, taking my time, drinking from my hydration pack, adjusting straps when they dug into my shoulders. The trail was narrow but clear. I met no one the entire day, which I told myself was exactly what I wanted. I pitched my tent near a stream as the sun dipped behind the trees, cooked a small meal, and listened to the water rushing over rocks until I fell asleep. The second day was when things shifted. I woke up earlier than I expected, a gray light coming through the fabric of my tent. The air was colder. I packed up quickly, ate a small breakfast, and started up the steeper section of the trail. The incline was steady and tiring. My legs burned. Sweat cooled on my back even in the crisp air. The trees grew sparser the higher I climbed, and patches of rock began to dominate the path. I felt good though, proud of myself for keeping a steady pace. Around midday, I reached a section of the trail that cut across a slope. On one side was the mountain wall rising up, jagged and gray, and on the other side was a drop that slid down into a thick forest far below. The trail itself was no more than a foot wide in places, crumbling in others. I had to keep my eyes on my boots, planting each step carefully. My backpack shifted my balance, and I kept my trekking pole planted hard in the dirt to steady myself. Halfway across that stretch, I heard something. It wasn't an animal noise like a bird or squirrel. It was heavy, sharp, like a boot scuffing rock. I froze, my ears strained, waiting. There it was again, behind me on the trail. I turned carefully, planting my feet wide to keep from slipping. The trail behind me was empty. My eyes scanned the slope, the rocks, the trees far below. Nothing moved. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just a stone tumbling loose from somewhere higher up, but the sound had been deliberate. Not falling rock, something stepping. I didn't like standing exposed on that trail, so I forced myself forward, step by step, until I reached the other side where the path widened and flattened out into a patch of dirt surrounded by brush. I stopped there to breathe and look back again. Still nothing. The silence pressed on me. I kept walking. That afternoon, the trail climbed into a thicket of twisted trees and undergrowth. The ground was uneven, roots sticking up like traps waiting to catch a boot. I slowed my pace, scanning the shadows between branches. The sound came again, closer this time. A crunch of leaves, definite, heavy, like a person trying to walk carefully but not carefully enough. I froze again, sweat slick on my forehead despite the cool air. I waited, listening. The forest was still. Then another sound, off to the right, deeper into the trees. A shift of weight. My stomach turned cold. I forced myself to move, fast now, pushing hard up the trail. Every few minutes I looked back, and every time the trail behind me was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Crawled on my skin, the sense of being followed. When I stopped to drink water, I heard it again. Pause when I paused. A step when I stepped. By the time the sun began to lower, I was desperate to find a place to set camp. I wanted somewhere open where I could see around me, not trapped under thick trees. But the trail didn't offer that. It dipped down into a ravine choked with brush. I had no choice but to stop there. I set up my tent quickly, hands shaking. I forced food down even though my stomach was knotted. The sound didn't come again while I was awake, but I couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. That night I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of twig made me jolt. At some point exhaustion pulled me under, but I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding. The forest was absolutely silent. Too silent. I listened hard, holding my breath. Then, faint, almost delicate, the sound of footsteps circling in the leaves outside my tent. Slow, careful, pausing every few steps. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay stiff, eyes wide open in the dark, listening as the steps came closer, then stopped right behind my tent. I could feel the weight of it, someone standing there. The seconds dragged out until my chest hurt from holding air. Then the steps started again, moving away, fading into the trees. I stayed frozen until dawn light seeped into the fabric of the tent. When I crawled out, the ground around my camp looked disturbed. Leaves pressed down, small scuffs in the dirt. No clear footprints, but enough to know I hadn't imagined it. Something had walked there. I packed up in a rush, nerves raw. My only thought was to get back to the trailhead as fast as I could. The loop I had planned no longer mattered. I wanted out. The problem was that the shortest way back was still ahead, not behind. Turning around meant adding a day. I didn't want another night out there, so I pushed forward hard. The day passed in a blur of panic and sweat. Every step I took felt watched. Every turn of the trail felt like a trap. The sounds came and went, always behind me, always at a distance. I tried once to catch whoever it was. I dropped my pack, stepped off the trail, and waited behind a tree. My heart pounded as I stood there, silent, listening. Minutes dragged by. Then, faintly, the crunch of footsteps. Coming closer. I gripped my trekking pole tight, sweat running down my spine. The steps came near, then stopped. I held my breath. Silence again. Couldn't take it. I burst out from behind the tree, scanning the trail. Nothing. Empty. That was the worst part. Never seeing them. Always hearing. Always knowing they were there, just out of sight. By late afternoon, I reached a section of the trail that cut through a clearing of tall grass. The sun slanted low, orange against the horizon. I kept my eyes sweeping the grass, certain I would see movement. I saw nothing, but the sound followed. Always the sound. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for water. I walked until my legs felt like they would snap. The trail began to descend, winding down the slope, switchback after switchback. The forest thickened again. Shadows stretched. I knew I couldn't make it to the trailhead before night. I had to camp again. The thought made me sick. I found a flat patch beside the trail, no better than the night before, but I had no choice. I set up my tent as fast as I could, my hands clumsy with fear. I crawled inside before the last light was gone and zipped it tight. I sat there, knees to chest, my knife in one hand, my trekking pole in the other. I didn't cook. I didn't eat. The forest outside went black. The sounds came again, first faint, then closer. Slow steps in the leaves, circling, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving. I sat frozen, every muscle locked, staring at the tent wall like I could see through it. Hours dragged. At one point, something brushed the fabric. Just the lightest touch. I stopped breathing. My chest screamed for air, but I didn't move. Then the touch was gone. At some point, maybe after midnight, the sounds faded. Exhaustion pulled me into a shallow, broken sleep. When dawn came, I didn't even bother with breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, left my tent poles half collapsed, anything to move faster. I was shaking, my lips cracked, my stomach hollow, but I kept walking. The last stretch of trail felt endless. My legs ached, blisters burning on my feet, but the fear kept me moving. The sounds still came now and then, always behind, always close. Once I thought I saw something in the trees. A flicker of movement, a shape slipping between trunks, but it was gone too fast to be sure. Then, finally, the trail widened, the trees thinned, and I saw the gravel lot of the trailhead through the branches. Relief slammed into me so hard I almost collapsed. I stumbled forward, faster, faster, until my boots hit the gravel. I turned, staring back into the forest. Empty, silent. I don't know who or what kind of person was out there following me. I never saw them, not once. But I know they were real. The sounds were too clear. I had been planning that hike for months. I had gone on many short trails before, but I wanted to test myself with something longer, something that would take me deep into the woods where I wouldn't hear cars or see houses. I wanted to push myself and spend a night out there, away from everything. The plan was simple. Hike a section of trail that cut through a stretch of mountains, carry all my gear, spend the night at a small clearing, and come back out the next day. I told myself it would be just me, my pack, and the quiet woods. I thought I was ready. The morning started calm. I parked at a small gravel pull-off where the trail began. There were no other cars there, which I liked because it meant I wouldn't run into many people. The air was cool, and I could smell damp soil and pine as soon as I stepped out. I adjusted my pack straps, checked the water bottles, and looked at the map one last time. The line on the paper looked easy enough to follow. It was only about 12 miles in and out with one night in the middle. I told myself I had done harder things before, though in truth I hadn't done anything quite like this. The first part of the hike was easy. The trail was wide, covered in leaves, and wound steadily upward. Sunlight came through in patches, and the air was still. My boots crunched over sticks and dirt, and every so often I saw a squirrel dart across the path. I tried to keep a steady pace, reminding myself not to get too tired too early. I carried enough food, water, and a small tent. My shoulders ached a little from the weight, but I ignored it. After about 2 hours, the trail narrowed and climbed more steeply. Rocks jutted out, and tree roots tangled across the dirt. I had to watch my footing. The forest grew thicker, and I noticed how quiet it became. I couldn't hear any cars, not even far in the distance. Just the sound of my breathing, the shuffle of my boots, and an occasional bird call. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the silence. I reached a ridge where I could see across the valley. The trees stretched endlessly, dark green rolling into pale blue hills in the distance. I sat down to drink water and ate a granola bar. Looking out, I thought about how far I already was from my car. The thought gave me a strange feeling in my stomach. It was exciting but also unsettling, knowing I was completely alone with no one around for miles. I pressed on. The sun moved higher, and the trail dipped down the other side of the ridge. The ground grew damp, with patches of mud where water had collected. The air felt cooler in the shade, and I noticed more insects buzzing around me. I stopped to tighten my pack straps again, then continued through the darker stretch of woods. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked on the map as my camp. It was a small flat clearing off the side of the trail, just wide enough for a tent. A few fallen logs sat nearby, and the ground was covered in leaves. I dropped my pack and stretched. My back was sore, and my legs felt heavy, but I was glad to be there. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the stakes held firm in the ground. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, placed my food in a bag to hang later, and checked my water. The air had grown still, and I noticed how quiet it was again. Even the birds seemed to have stopped. I told myself it was normal. Animals get quiet at certain times of day. I spent the evening walking a little around the clearing, looking for firewood even though I didn't plan to make a fire. I just wanted to move, to keep busy. The forest felt thicker as the sun dropped, the trees pressing closer together, their branches stretching above like a ceiling. I kept glancing around, though I didn't know why. It was just me out there. As dusk settled, I ate a simple meal and cleaned up. I hung my food bag high in a tree, tied it tight, and double-checked it. I didn't want anything sniffing around camp at night. Afterward, I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. That was when the quiet really sank in. Inside the tent, I could hear every little thing. A faint rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig somewhere in the dark, the distant creak of a tree moving in the wind. Each sound felt louder than it should have been. I tried to remind myself that animals live out here, and the forest never truly goes silent. Still, I found myself lying stiff in my bag, staring up at the thin fabric roof, listening harder than I wanted to. Sleep came in pieces. I would drift off for a while, then wake suddenly, sure I had heard something. Once I thought I heard heavy steps not far from the tent, slow and deliberate. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, waiting. But after a few minutes, it was quiet again. I told myself it must have been my imagination, a branch falling or maybe a deer. I tried to believe it. When morning finally came, I felt relief. Sunlight pushed through the tent walls, and I crawled out to find the forest calm again. I made a quick breakfast, packed my things, and prepared to head back. I was tired, but I wanted to get moving. The hike back started fine, but something felt different. Maybe it was just me being worn out, but the forest seemed darker even in daylight. The trail looked unfamiliar in some places, though I knew I was on the right path. I walked faster than before, wanting to reach the car before evening. Around midday, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers for a while. I stopped, pulled out the map, and looked around. The ground dipped strangely, and the trees looked thicker on both sides. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. My stomach knotted. I forced myself to stay calm. I backtracked slowly, scanning for the last marker. My boots slid in mud, and I tripped over roots more than once. Sweat ran down my back, and I kept looking over my shoulder, though I didn't know what for. Every sound in the forest now felt sharp, like it was meant for me. I walked for nearly an hour before I admitted to myself I was lost. The trail had vanished, or I had stepped off without noticing. My legs ached, and my water was running low. I sat on a fallen log and tried to breathe. I told myself I would find my way. The trail couldn't be far. But as the day wore on, I only grew more tangled in the woods. The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched long between the trees. Panic clawed at me, but I kept moving, hoping to stumble across a familiar turn. Instead, I found thicker undergrowth, steeper ground, and silence that pressed on my ears until I felt dizzy. By evening, I accepted I wouldn't make it out before dark. I searched for a flat spot and set the tent up again. My hands shook as I drove the stakes in. I hadn't planned for another night. I had enough food, but the thought of staying out again unsettled me deeply. That night was worse than the first. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest move around me. I swore I heard steps again, heavier than before, pacing somewhere beyond the tent. My throat was dry, and my chest felt tight with fear. I clutched my flashlight but didn't turn it on, afraid to draw attention. Every snap, every rustle felt closer, more deliberate. I barely slept. When dawn came, I packed quickly and set off again, forcing myself to push through exhaustion. My legs felt heavy, and every muscle ached. I drank the last of my water by mid-morning. My mouth grew dry, and I could feel the weakness spreading through me. The forest seemed endless. I tried to keep track of the sun to guide me, but the canopy often hid it. Hours passed, and I stumbled more than once. My boots rubbed blisters on my feet, and my pack felt heavier with each step. I kept thinking about the car, about the gravel pull-off, about the sight of pavement. I pictured it over and over, using it to pull myself forward. By late afternoon, I found a small stream trickling through rocks. I dropped to my knees and drank, the cold water shocking me awake. I filled my bottles, knowing it might be the only source I would find for a while. The stream gave me a burst of hope, and I followed it downhill, thinking it might lead to a larger river or maybe even back to the trail. But the stream wound deeper into the forest, twisting and splitting, and I quickly lost sense of direction again. As the light faded, I knew I had to camp another night. My hands trembled as I set the tent up, my body weak and sore. That night was the worst. I heard movement close, too close. Branches cracking, leaves shifting. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed frozen in my bag, barely breathing, gripping my knife though I doubted it would do much. The steps circled once, then faded. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I forced myself up. My body screamed in protest, but I had no choice. I packed and pushed forward, following the slope downhill. My mind grew foggy from exhaustion, but I kept moving. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker, like the forest itself was pressing down on me. Then, late that afternoon, I stumbled out onto a dirt service road. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I dropped my pack and sat in the dust, breathing hard. The road stretched in both directions, and I didn't know which way led out, but just knowing I was